Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Talia.
Sure thing.
Yeah. So I think is Matt okay if
Thanks a lot.
yeah, it started. Can I start now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm currently in interview with Matthew Stoller, who, despite being not a great fan of the British monarchy, has titles to rival all of them, starting from activist, investigative journalist, congressional aide to Congressman Alan Grayson in 2009, fellow at the Open Markets Institute, director of research at the American Economic Liberty Project. And have I missed anything more?
I don't know. I mean, I'm just a writer. That's really all I do.
That's a bit of an understatement. But anyway, I'd like to start by going back to the start of 2021, when with vaccines, there was widespread optimism about a great recovery, a back to better normal, and good GDP growth. But that optimism has now turned into trepidation with the supply chain meltdown, with empty shelves, clogged ports, cars in Britain waiting to get their petrol filled. One could have seen this coming with the big boat stuck in the Suez, but you saw this coming in 2020, the February 2020, much before the pandemic was even a thing in a lot of places, with the article about the great supply shock. So could you let us know how you came to this premonition?
Yeah, so I've been paying attention to the consolidation of economic power for, I guess, about, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And that, so there's been this movement in really since the late 1970s, but it accelerated into the 1990s to allow for firms to get bigger and dominate markets. The idea being that dominant firms are more efficient. That's what economists thought. Well, if you're big because you're efficient. And there was a similar related movement to create to reduce inventories. This was called the just-in-time manufacturing model, and it started in Toyota, and then it expanded into the U.S. in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And so now what we have is a series of dominant firms that run extremely lean, hyper-efficient systems of production and distribution. Now, hyper-efficient systems of production and distribution, it sounds really good,
Yeah.
Unless, you have a problem with one of the systems that you rely on. Because the trade-off with dominant firms in this hyper-efficient system is resiliency.
Yes.
And so I looked at a series of supply chain crashes that took place in, I guess, starting in the late 1990s. And this was actually a guy named Barry Litt who discovered it, but I did some work to look into it as well. And what you saw was that there were shortages, and there were shortages. This is way before the pandemics. This was 2010, 2010-11, when the Fukushima earthquake hit in Japan. And there were certain goods that were only manufactured in that region of Japan. And so you saw shortages of those products. And since they were integrated into the global supply chain kind of had a hiccup. And you saw this over and over, but they were kind of like isolated incidents. And when I saw COVID, because I pay a lot of attention to China, and I saw that, COVID was going to happen worldwide, which was not, it doesn't take a genius to see that a contagious disease, is going to go everywhere. But people often don't want to believe the obvious. But I'm like, yeah, this is going to happen. And then I looked and I said, okay, well, we have all of these really fragile, hyper efficient supply chains. So we're going to have really serious problems because of that. And so I wrote that out and said, look, we're going to have shortages because the hiccups that we've been seeing over the last 10, 15, 20 years, shortages of everything from like videotapes to pharmaceuticals, that seemed like a one-off, they're going to become pervasive. And that's what's happened.
Okay. So what you're saying essentially is that there's been a sacrifice of efficiency for security, and because the pandemic, there's neither right now.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, so efficiency, we sacrifice security for efficiency.
Yeah, and there's neither today.
Yeah, we have neither. That's right.
Okay. And another factor that's being discussed in this supply chain meltdown is the labor shortage or the great resignation. There are a lot of people just quitting their jobs. There are a record number of job openings and nobody's joining. So how much of that has to do with the supply chain crisis? And do you think this is in a way similar to the early 1930s awakening of labor again after the pandemic?
Uh, yeah, I do think it's similar. So I think that worldwide there's been, the focus on efficiency is very much about, reducing
Yeah.
costs of suppliers and, to create cheap consumer goods. Now, the biggest cost of most goods in terms of suppliers is labor,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's farmers, I know there are big protests in India over farming questions, or whether it's workers in factories or engineers or whatever. If you can take that cost out, then according to this theory of kind of hyper efficiency, then you should. But what that meant, at least in the US and I think worldwide, is that you've seen a suppression of wages and wage growth. And you've seen poor working conditions in everything from manufacturing to trucking to agriculture. And after, 30, 40 years of this, people get kind of tired of it. And when a bunch of people got laid off during the pandemic, they realized, okay, well, we don't have job security, and we are not interested in coming back to work for the same wages and the same conditions, when the promise of job security is now gone. And so the consequence of 40 years of just treating workers like they're expendable is that workers have, they have little reason to try to stretch themselves to get back to work. And instead, what you're seeing is strikes. You're seeing a lot of people who are not unionized. They're quitting. They're trying to find something else to do. A lot of people have retired early. So you have this significant labor shortage.
Okay. So now we've come to your main factor that we've seen Knots do over and over again. That's monopoly power. And in your book Goliath, which is a great read, by the way, you mentioned that most of world history can be defined as a struggle between monopoly and democracy. Now, that's a bit of a huge statement to make. Apart from US history, are there prior instances in world history that you can say confirm to this narrative or statement of yours? What made you?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's so the one of the I guess the foundational monopolies that connects the U.S. and India is the East India Trading Company.
Yeah.
And that was, Adam Smith wrote, when he wrote Wealth of Nations, there's a lot of parts of Wealth of Nations where he criticizes monopoly power, and what he means was basically the East India Company. And in the U.S., the Boston Tea Party, one of the things that they were really afraid of is that when they monopolized tea, the tea trade, is that they would monopolize other aspects of critical goods that they needed. And they looked over and they saw what the East India Company did in Bengal and said, oh, they could do that here. And, the East India Company, that obviously like mass starvation and whatnot in India. And so it was, they saw that dominant market power, which came from the crown, could be incredibly destructive to a society, not just taking away liberties, not just charging higher prices, but actually killing large numbers of people. And that's always been the fear of that. The market power, the use of financing tools, has always been a key mechanism by which every society runs, whether it's a more democratic society or a less democratic society. It's just, these are the fundamental tools for making things, distributing things, financing things. And so how you run them is kind of a core part of how you run a society. So you could see like usury caps in, Babylonian times.
Yeah.
It's just kind of foundational to how humans interact with one another. Once you get beyond a kind of hunter-gatherer society, when there's some organizational complexity.
Okay. And as I was going through reading reviews of Goliath, I came upon this very interesting review from The Nation, I think. And their counter argument essentially was that you describe America's golden age as being this post-war era till the late 60s, the late 70s, when the New Deal coalition broke up. And their assertion was that that era existed because America was the only developed country, the only industrialized country that survived the Second World War without any significant damage. And by the time the 70s happened, you saw Japan, you saw Germany, and a few other countries come on their own and behave as industrial competition. And that was what led to the breakdown of the New Deal order. What do you say to that argument?
So there have been periods in American history where you had more egalitarian political economy choices, and there have been periods where we've had less egalitarian political choices. There's a kind of quasi-Marxist argument that just sort of says all history is kind of scientifically determined, and it's all kind of inevitable and the result of sort of the inevitable movement of capitalism. And the critique of that particular critique in The Nation sort of lined up on the idea that, well, you had monopoly capitalism in the United States that was successful, and there were labor unions that sort of shared the monopoly rent with the monopolists, and then you had international competition, and that really undermined that particular sort of model. But I think that basically overlooks a whole bunch of just policy choices that policymakers made in the 40s and 50s and 60s to explicitly offshore jobs in return for a certain geopolitical goals. And there was nothing inevitable about it. It was just a specific set of choices on how to organize the Cold War. And, going back, the US has been pretty egalitarian at some points and very non-egalitarian at other points. And it's not really related to necessarily to global competition. It's just related to domestic political debates and which ideas are dominant at which points. So to kind of give a counterexample, in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, the US was a pretty closed off economy. After World War I, you had a lot of tariffs and the international trading system broke down. It really didn't get reconstructed until the 1950s. In the 20s, you had a very monopolized economy with low labor representation. In the 30s and 40s, you had a much less monopolized economy with a lot more labor representation in our economic choices. And it really didn't, it was the same sort of closed off economy. So it wasn't like international forces made that big a deal here. So I don't actually buy that critique.
Okay. So you were talking about policy choices in the 1970s, and that reminded me of this interview Paul Volcker, the former federal chief, had, I think, in Reuters, where he said that allies would come into Nixon's office and they'd ask for something and he'd just give them away something else. I don't remember the exact quote, but he was alluding to what you said. And Nixon is probably a very underrated president for his economic impact, starting from his contact with China to him breaking down Bretton Woods. So I just like to know, what do you think made Nixon break down Bretton Woods, and how did that benefit the US's economic and geopolitical status, and how did that shape the international financial system that we see today?
So, that's not my area of expertise, but I can tell you what I think about it, which is Nixon wasn't very interested in the economy at all. He didn't care. He was a foreign policy. Yeah, he was a political animal, and he didn't really care about the economy. But he was also part of a trend where really since the 50s up until the 70s and 80s, there weren't a lot of policymakers that actually cared about the economy, because they thought, well, America's so big and rich, it doesn't matter what we do. We can give away jobs and industrial capacity, and we are so wealthy that whatever, it doesn't matter. And the middle class started to suffer because their factories were being traded away. So Henry Kissinger traded away like the shoemaking of New England. He traded that to Spain and said, oh, you guys can make our shoes and profit off of that, in return for which you will not allow the communists to take over Spain. So he was helping Franco. And that was just one random example. and they just would give away all of these industries. And what started to happen is it started to really hurt Americans. But they thought, middle class Americans in particular, they thought, oh well, we're so wealthy, it doesn't really matter. With regards to Nixon and Bretton Woods, I mean, that was part of the strategy. He did the that's why he was giving away whatever to allies. But with Bretton Woods, it was that was more of a financial arrangement where after World War II, international trade and financing was mediated by public governments. Yeah. And they mediated it by saying, we're going to fix exchange rates, and we're going to regulate banks and make sure that if people want to exchange money and trade across borders, that governments make sure that there aren't cartels, there aren't monopolies, and we're going to manage that trade. And in 71, Nixon essentially turned over management of the currency and of international trade financing to private banks. That was a significant. It was kind of a deregulatory move. And after that, that was part of a way of getting rid of the heavily regulated financial system that had run the U.S. economy and the global economy, and set the stage, I think, for the increasing financial instability that we've seen ever since.
Okay, so would you say a right substitute for this current international financial system would be something like what Keynes proposed in the Bretton Woods Conference originally, where there was this international clearing union?
That's right.
Bancor, and countries coming together with surpluses and deficits to settle it mutually. Would that be,
that's right. Well, not to settle it mutually, to put the concern, or to put the burden on the country with the trade surplus.
Yeah.
Right. So right now, like Germany has the trade surplus, and they keep lecturing everyone, and they're the ones who are in control of the situation. And so countries with a trade deficit can't do anything about it. What Keynes realized is that what needs to happen is you need to have the countries that have power, which is usually the ones with the trade surplus. They're the ones that have to be forced to actually allow imports or export less, or foster domestic growth, which is what Germany refuses to do. Same thing with China.
So now that you've gone to Germany and China, you've argued that China today is the Nazi Germany of 1935. But a lot of people would say, conventionally, agreeing that there's a new Cold War, that it's more like the imperial competition between Great Britain and Kaiser's Germany, between the US and China. And now the US-China relationship is really unique, because there's a certain argument that there's never going to be a US-China conflict because of business interests. But globalization was at its peak at the beginning of World War I. So that's not true, in my opinion. But doesn't it disprove the fact that there was this common theory that globalization will prevent war? I don't know what exactly it was, the name, but trade will reduce conflict between nations.
That was Thomas Friedman. And no two countries with a McDonald's have ever gone to war with each other.
Yeah. So that doesn't this disprove the notion of US and China, with US and China? And what do you see? Is it Nazi Germany, or is it Kaiser's Germany?
I think it's Nazi Germany, early 30s, not late 30s.
Okay.
What the issue with, because China's not just picking a fight with the US, right? And the US isn't particularly aggressive. The US is basically just sort of sitting there with a network of hundreds of bases, and it's not expanding. It's just sort of sitting there. To the extent that we're doing anything, it's withdrawing. I mean, that's the withdrawal from Afghanistan was that. And I understand that people, there's a lot of resentment against the U.S. for, good reason. The U.S. has not, our foreign policy has been really pretty bad for quite some time. So I get it. I get that there's no, people are not saying, oh yeah, human rights, like America stands for human rights. I get it. But if you want to look at what's, the real dangerous actor in the world right now, it's clearly the Chinese. They are engaged. The Chinese government is engaged in ethnic cleansing domestically, but also, they have very clear. I mean, they keep it strategically ambiguous, but you can see the direction of sort of replacing whatever kind of order we have now with a much more authoritarian order, which is kind of dominated and controlled by China. And they would prefer to get there without going to war. So there's kind of less of a martial spirit, like, Hitler wanted war. That was a big part of what they're doing. And I think the Chinese are probably less, I don't think their first choice is war just because nuclear weapons make that a non-starter. But they are, they have the same vision of political economy, the same idea that we're going to be the key bottleneck in all supply chains. So everybody has to be dependent on us. And they have a Han supremacist point of view. They want to make sure that every country has to do what they say, at least what China's core interests are concerned, and Chinese core interests have this tendency to expand. So you can see, I mean, there's also no access to the Chinese political system for anyone except for a very small group of people in China versus, the US, where it's a pretty open political system and
the most open society ever, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, you have no idea what's going on in China right now.
Yeah.
And there's no reporting, so we don't know. I mean, so it's kind of things like, did China accidentally create the coronavirus, right? We just don't know. And there's a lot of things like that we just don't know. And I mean, the US, I think the ideas behind what we've been doing for a long time have been really toxic. It's frankly true for Europe as well. They like to pretend like they're nice or whatever, but they're not. The neoliberal framework is just bad. It produces bad outcomes, and the West has run itself according to neoliberal frameworks, and that's been really toxic in a lot of ways and hurt a lot of people. China is different, though. China is just overtly authoritarian and fascist, and they have global ambitions. So there we go.
Sort of like Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So
sort of like what?
Sort of like Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton is the neoliberal, Donald Trump's just.
Yeah, I mean, you could put it that way if you want. I think Donald Trump is. I don't think Donald Trump is remotely similar to Xi Jinping or China. I mean, he has authoritarian tendencies, but no, this is not. This is when I see Nazis. I mean, it's really scary and dangerous, like in a way that, Donald Trump is obnoxious and he has his authoritarian tendencies. You could see him going that way, but he hasn't yet.
Yeah. So although you've really been very scared of China and you talk about this, but the left today is defending China, in the US House of Representatives, the China competitive bill is being held by progressives who want softer Chinese language on China. I had a conversation with Noam Chomsky, and he actually said China's policy in geopolitics is mostly defensive. And I actually went to a long back and forth with him, but his point was that. So can the US really get its act together to get ahead of China, especially when China is using the Belt and Road Initiative to sort of make itself the center of a world island with Asia, Europe, and Africa? I mean, the US just seems like a mess at this point. It really seems inevitable, doesn't it, in a certain sense?
It does feel that way. I mean, the left is totally out of touch with what's happening. For whatever reason, they can't seem to imagine a world in which the Chinese government, has aims and ambitions. They just seem to think that America is the center of the world. Therefore, if something's happening, it's because we want it to happen or we don't want it to happen. And the way that, and they don't like, it's a variant of, it's just American exceptionalism. It's except that instead of saying everything America does is good, they say everything America does is bad. But either way, America is in control. And I don't think that that's true. I think America is a powerful country, but it's just one country of many. And China happens to be an up and coming country that is punching way above its weight. And it has a lot of weight to throw around anyway. So in that sense, I'm astonished at a lot of the left that it just they just lack any sense of awareness of what the aims of the Chinese government are, or of what liberal democracy is fundamentally. They just don't really believe in it. But yeah, I mean, the US is and I think this is true of Europe too. I mean, this is the West, right? And I don't know if people want to say the West, but it's not like India is particularly well governed right now. I mean,
I have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, look, the thing is if you look at China, right? China, the difference between China and everywhere else in the world is that the Chinese government, they actually govern, right?
Yeah.
They're
They're an efficient
fascist.
autocracy.
Well, we don't know enough to know that they're efficient, but they have said we are not going to let the financial markets run us. They've decided to crash the financial markets through policy choices. They have broken up or dealt with their tech companies. They are governing. They're saying no kids are going to be allowed to play video games unless at this time or that time. It's like they don't spend a lot of time fretting and getting super upset about things and then not do anything. They actually have their government act. And now it's not always a good thing. Authoritarians tend to do, sometimes they do good things, but oftentimes they do really bad things and they go way like in the wrong direction, but they act. And I think what neoliberalism is, and neoliberalism is not just in the US, it's everywhere except for China, is it's a ideology that does not allow for the for collective action through public institutions. So the US government, the European project, and I think a lot of governments around the world are they're incapable of governing. They are incapable of taking collective action, which is why no one has dealt with Facebook adequately. No one has dealt with it. It's not like that, this is not just a US problem. This is a global problem. Yeah. Google, same thing. The only country that's dealt with Google effectively, China just banned it. But Russia actually had a coherent antitrust action against Google. And now they have a competitive search market between Google and Yandex, because they actually brought an antitrust case that was successful and actually fixed the problem. Meanwhile, in Europe, you have Margaret Vestager, who is the antitrust enforcer, and gets lots of press for saying Google is bad. But then, they've been going at Google for 10 years and they haven't changed the market structure at all. And they have all these privacy rules and they don't enforce any of them. So it's not like, the Europeans are in a particularly good state. It's just, so what's happened is there's this broad ideological view, I think, among most policymakers on the center, left, and right, that everything is inevitable, that government can't do anything, that big business is sort of dominant and runs the world. And so the only kind of response is you get these kind of figures like Donald Trump. I think you could put Modi in there. You could say a whole series of them who say, I'm going to make the trains run on time. Yeah. And that's a response to this kind of collapse of legitimacy of the democratic systems.
Yeah. So another thing about China and the US is just how much control China has over American culture, especially with the NBA not being allowed to talk about Hong Kong or the Uyghurs, and Disney erasing Taiwan's flag from the back of the Top Gun jacket. The examples just countless and countless. And there's this very interesting story that I'd seen on one of your articles where you talked about how Chaplin's The Great Dictator was almost banned until FDR had to intervene. And I didn't find it anywhere else. So I thought, could you build on that and just describe what China is doing to the American movie industry?
Yeah, I mean, we can't forget about TikTok, which, 100 million Americans use TikTok. And I think
too many Indians.
What?
Too many Indians.
Yeah, I mean, it's a Chinese platform, and I think the Chinese government is obviously using it to promote their interests. So it's, in the 1930s, Hollywood studios, they wanted to sell movies, right? They were selling them worldwide. And Charlie Chaplin wanted to make a movie about Hitler. And so he made The Great Dictator, which was a satire of Hitler. And but he had a really hard time financing it because the studios who were didn't want to offend the German government, because then they wouldn't be able to sell their movies in Germany, which is ironic because a lot of the Hollywood studios heads were Jewish, but they didn't want to offend the Nazis because they were selling movies. And so FDR actually, I think, made some calls and said, no, Charlie Chaplin, you have to make this movie. It's very important. And he ultimately did. That's sort of the story that you asked about. And I think today you see, as you noted, the US government has said that the Chinese use their import market for films to censor basically all Western filmmaking,
Yeah.
right? So nobody wants to make a movie that's critical of China. No one wants to say anything critical of China, because if you do, then you won't be able to export into China, and people may not want to hire you because they might be afraid that they won't be able to export into China. And then you have Disney and, Comcast NBC, which is Universal. They have giant theme parks in China, and because Hollywood is very consolidated, there's only basically 5 or 6 companies that are of any importance, and all of them want to have access to China or do have large investments in China. None of them are going to say anything that's critical of China, and they will all kind of self-censor the way that maybe not as severely as the Chinese artists would in China, but it's still pretty bad.
Yeah. And you talked about the consolidation in Hollywood, and I think you had a very interesting perspective to Martin Scorsese's grouse about cinema not being made today, and everyone just thought it was an old man's rant, but you really brought in a very unique perspective there. So could you talk about that, about what were the economics driving Martin Scorsese's lamentation that cinema is not being made today?
Yeah, so he was criticized. He was saying, look, Marvel movies, the superhero movies, they're like theme park rides. They are not film, right? Which was it's a little bit of a snobbish thing to say. That he's like, look, art. This is lowbrow stuff. It isn't art, and we don't make art anymore. Now, I like Marvel movies, right? They're fun, but one thing to understand is that he was actually making an art, and I think one of the things he said is like, these kinds of artistic movies can't get funding anymore, and they can't get distribution. And that I thought was really interesting, because the Hollywood system used to be pretty distributed. So you did have like 6 or 7 or 8 studios, which, it's not that many studios, but you also had independent movie producers. More importantly, you had a bunch of distributors, and you had thousands of independent movie theaters who would get their movies from these distributors. And so if you made a movie that was popular, it was pretty easy to go and sell it to movie theaters, because, you'd go to a guy who owned 5 movie theaters, and he would say, oh yeah, this movie looks good. I'll take it. See if it works. I'll put it in a screen. And if it works well, I'll put it in a couple of screens. And then those movie chains got consolidated in the 90s. And so now you have to the point where you have like basically like 2 or 3 movie chains with 4,000 screens across the US. And then now they're global. And what that means is that instead of being able to open a movie in a couple of screens and see if it does well and expand it, movies get opened in 4,000 screens in the US and like 10,000 screens around the world. And the opening weekend, which is all driven by advertising, there's no like word of mouth, doesn't really affect it. All of the money comes in like the opening weekend, or half the money comes in opening weekend. And so that kind of distribution mechanism creates an incentive for films that already have pre-existing intellectual property people know, AKA Marvel movies, superhero movies, movies that like Star Trek, stuff that people, already have a sense of. But it prevents it doesn't entirely prevent it, but it can prevent the creation of new types of stories, and it can kill the mid-market stuff, especially the localized mid-market stuff. So in the US, the problem has been that we don't have as many mid-market comedies anymore, because comedies don't translate as well internationally, because the senses of humor are inherently kind of more regional and based on like localized culture. So the last great comedy series in the US was the Hangover franchise, about 10 years ago, right? Because people don't like studios. There are fewer studios. They have to release it on 10,000 screens at once, and they are afraid of doing that with a comedy. So they're not. So we don't have comedies made anymore. And I think if you look at what Martin Scorsese was saying, he wasn't talking about comedies. He was talking about certain forms of film that was like artistic. But comedy is a form of art, and it's that mid-market segment that no longer exists because you can't distribute it and you can't finance it because it's all been consolidated. And I think that's what's interesting. It's not that Marvel movies are bad. It's just that that's all there is now, because that's what the monopoly distribution enables.
Yeah. So you described Hollywood's 2 problems broadly as China and monopolies. And you also said that China itself behaves as a monopoly. And obviously, since you are self-describing yourself as a China hawk, you'd support Trump's trade war. which was widely criticized by economists all over the world. And this is something that Joseph Stiglitz, who is a relatively respectable economist, who was a critic of globalization, wrote about that. He said that China is slowly moving towards domestic demand and can handle a trade war better because it has more control, and that despite all the IP theft charges, most companies still stay in China. And if the US were to remove most of its restrictions on Chinese companies, the trade deficit would be smaller. He also said that history simply can't be reversed to bring back jobs, that technology takes a certain route and you can't reverse it, as that would disrupt supply chains. And he even said that the cheap imports from China were what kept inflationary pressures low and not the actions of the Federal Reserve. This was in 2017, I think, in Vanity Fair, and it's been a long time. So what do you make of this? Has he been right? Has he been wrong? What does he mean? What does he mean?
Well, no, I mean, of course he's
Not a
wrong.
hack.
Like, it's
because he's not a hack. He's definitely a very genuine person.
Oh, Stiglitz is a hack. Of course, he's a hack. He was a Clinton economist in the 1990s. You got to understand, like, first of all, he's got a Nobel Prize in economics. That right there should tell you he's a hack. Like yeah, of course you can bring jobs back. These are political choices. If you want to do that, you can. It's just that we've made, we started this in the beginning. There's a whole theory of inevitabilism, right? All of the stuff in the 1950s and 60s, it was all inevitable. And, when there was international competition, it was all inevitable that labor would get screwed. Oh, we can't, all these jobs moved offshore. It was all inevitable. And now we can't bring them back because that's just the way technology works. And it's like, that is all bullshit. The Chinese government, the strategists there made choices to say, we're going to bring productive capacity here. US executives, US policymakers made explicit choices to move our capacity to China because they thought it was a good idea. We could reverse that if we wanted to. These are all just contingent political choices. The idea that we have all of these things are inevitable, that there are no that there are no tools that we could use to address any of our social challenges. It's all part of neoliberalism. It's all part of saying our collective governance capacity cannot possibly work. Don't bother trying. It's nonsense. It's irritating. I can't believe that economists even exist. These people are, they are wrong. They are idiots. They are malevolent. I mean, not Stiglitz, I'm not speaking to him specifically, but like pretty much everything, every important aspect of political economy that's happened, incidents that have happened without economists predicting them, but often with economists facilitating them. You didn't see very many economists saying in 2005 and 6, oh, there's going to be a financial crisis. Though I think there was the Davos at Davos, I forget what his name is.
Raghuram Rajan.
Yeah. So he said this is a dangerous financial system, and he was ridiculed for that. Yeah. And it's not like the people who ridiculed him were drummed out of the profession. Like they're still as influential. Larry Summers, they're still as influential as they ever were. But you saw this similarly in the mid 2000s. Economists said, oh, there's no problem with jobs moving to China. It's not having any bad impacts in the US. And then 10 years later, some economists say, oh, actually, we've discovered there's this thing called the China shock. There were all of these jobs that got lost. Who knew? And it's like the people that were telling you at the time who were losing their jobs knew, but you didn't think it was happening until 10 years later when a fellow economist said it was happening. And I mean, this is just consistent and pervasive. In 2012, the Federal Trade Commission did not bring an antitrust case against Google because the economists at the FTC said, there's no case here. You know what? I know that Google is going to try to dominate mobile search, and this was a prediction they made. They said no one will ever use a search engine on their mobile phone. These were economists who made these predictions. Okay. It's just, these people make asinine predictions over and over. They have no ideas they didn't predict the supply chain crisis. They have no ideas about how to address it. Like these are, I mean, to call them witch doctors, to call them like astrologers would be to give witch doctors or astrologers a bad name. Like these are agents of monopoly. We should not listen to them. I mean, they're free to write their stupid papers, but we should not listen to them because they've been wrong and they have been catastrophic in their way of thinking about the world. In some cases, actively corrupt, actively on the payroll of bad actors. I have nothing but contempt for economists. And I think that economists, by and large, should be ignored by policymakers to the extent that they can ignore them, unless they got it right. I mean, you know, and there are some who got it right, but there
Now,
aren't many.
Raghuram Rajan, for the one who got it right, his explanation for the crisis was essentially that there was a huge drop in demand among US consumers because their jobs were lost. So a lot of free credit, a lot of cheap credit was just flooded into the market, and that led to a housing bubble. And the speculation on the stock market essentially blew that bubble, and along with it, the whole global economy. Since you were there at the time, you were actually part of the policy response, I can say, not happily. Do you think that's the correct assessment of what happened in 2008?
I don't remember that. I think his assessment was, he talked about fracture, like
Fracture
he talked
line.
about fragility in the financial system. So I don't totally remember his argument. As I recall, it was a little bit more subtle than what you're saying, because I think he was talking about
this was in a
derivatives.
later lecture where he very specifically was even going for austerity. He was like, you ought to train workers to adapt to time. And so that was why his opinion was very strange to me.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't followed him in detail. I just remember that he said what he said in 2005, and I was like, all right, I respect that.
An interesting tidbit about Rajan was that he became the governor of India's central bank when India was going through a stagflationary crisis, and he was basically Volcker light. So Modi ended up as Reagan and Thatcher. And that's my question, basically. But, you know, we can talk about Bolsonaro or Orban or Putin or even Trump as these products of the bad effects of neoliberalism. But Modi is much more of a 80s neoliberal Thatcher, Reagan style figure. And these people were never beaten in their lifetime. Even Clinton and Blair, they only beat the less charismatic deputies. So how do you handle these sort of figures?
Right. You know, I mean, Trump's big of, like, I wasn't really a supporter of Trump's trade war because I didn't think that he did nearly enough. I mean, he put some tariffs up, but he didn't, you know, if he had actually brought back any supply chains, we wouldn't be having this massive supply chain problem that we're having. Like, he didn't actually follow through on what he said he would. He just put up some tariffs and then left it at that.
You're Ann Coulter with the trade war.
Sorry, what?
You're like Ann Coulter with the trade war. You know how she totally turned on him about the wall. You turned on him with the trade war. That's basically.
I was never a Trump supporter, so I don't know that I would say I turned on him, because I was never like, this guy's doing the right thing. I just think that, like, you know, because bringing back, you know, supply chains and diversifying supply chains, which is, you know, I'm not a protectionist. I think diversifying supply chains is important. It doesn't have to all be in the US, but some of it has to be. I think, you know, you have to do a lot of, you have to build ecosystems to facilitate, you know, to help businesses grow and make things here. You have to make deliberate policy choices to make that happen. And we just didn't do that. Anyway, you know, how do you beat these guys? I mean, I don't know.
I'm not talking about Trump, because he's been beaten. So there's an example there. But Modi is more like a Reagan or Thatcher. So that's the tougher person.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to have a coherent opposition. And, you know, right now, the problem is that we, you know, the sort of center left, which is, I think, where I fit in, the Democratic Party, and I think the center left globally, you know, they're snobs. Yeah, they're the Stiglitzes of the world. They think of, you know, they want to turn some knobs here or there, and they ultimately are not particularly interested in business. They're not particularly interested in thinking coherently about monopoly power and what it means. You know, they don't really have any respect for people who work for a living. So if you wanna beat a Modi, or you want to beat a you know, a Trump or someone like that, you know, the way to do it, these are not figures who are that hard to beat, but it's impossible to beat them if you're running on a platform of, I'm better than you, and, like, your culture sucks, right? Which is what the left has been running on for decades.
Yeah, the new left, basically. So you've kept calling, I don't know, you've got a huge hate war with economists. And your critique is further than economists, where you even extend further in disapproving of central banks and you want legislative control over our monetary policy. You suggested that there'd be credit control. But when Nixon tried wage and price control, it failed, as Keynes predicted. So I'm not sure how would credit control work, and if it has ever worked anywhere else in the world. Hello?
You're saying legislative control over central banks has never worked anywhere?
I mean, as far as I'm talking about credit control more specifically, because I haven't seen any example of credit control in history.
Well, there were credit controls in the US during World War II.
Yeah, but
I mean, there were credit controls during, like, are you talking about the specific mechanism of credit controls, or are you talking about a democratic control over a central bank?
I think I was asking you about both because you've suggested both at different points of time. I remember you suggested credit control somewhere in the early 10s when you were talking about Volcker. And you now recently you were like, after seeing the Federal Reserve, I think stock scandal or something, you were like, let's just abolish it and let's just have them legislative control over everything. And that's kind of scary because these legislatures can't agree to anything. So
that's not true. Look, one of the reasons that the legislatures, I don't believe in abolishing the Fed. I just think that the Federal Reserve should be run directly as a committee in by Congress or by the president. And during World War II, it was from 1933 until roughly 1952, the Federal Reserve did what the president told it to do. They kept interest rates at the rate that the president wanted it at. And then there was this fight, which concluded in 1952 or 3, called the Fed Treasury Accord, in which the Fed was able to make policy on their own around monetary policy. And then Volcker kind of completed it in the late 70s, early 80s, which is when Federal Reserve independence became the sacred cow. So it worked really well. That's when the US policy was far more egalitarian. The central bank, was responsive to an elected official, aka the president. And I don't really care if the central bank is run by the president or if it's run by Congress, but it should be run by somebody who's accountable to the public instead of to people who are accountable to Wall Street, which is how it's run now. Okay. The Congress absolutely, is at a historic low point right now. I don't think anybody disputes that. Yeah. But one of the reasons that Congress is so feeble is because they don't have any real responsibility. And the Fed basically says, we'll take care of making sure the economy grows. We'll take care of all important decisions. And all you have to do is vote for a bailout occasionally. And what that does is it infantilizes Congress. And if Congress had to make a choice every 3 months or however often to raise or lower interest rates, they would take that very seriously. But the fact that they have no responsibility over how our economy functions because the Fed has said, don't worry, we'll take care of it, has destroyed and enfeebled Congress. And then thus has destroyed and enfeebled our democratic systems.
Okay. So now that you've talked about enfeebling democratic systems in Congress, I have to ask you, what is your grouse with Instagram influencer Barack Obama? Because for a certain generation.
And you really paid attention to what I say. This is flattering and a little.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with you in the wrong way. But
what's my deal with Obama and Instagram?
No. It's just you've used that term, Instagram influencer, and this guy's been a political idol for my entire generation. The first book I read was The Audacity of Hope. Like I was 6, so you've really destroyed my childhood fantasy right now.
Sorry about that. Look, my view of Obama is that he is who he is, and I think he pursued very bad policies when he was a president. He pursued policies to consolidate wealth and power, and he did that because people believed in him, and they thought he was, trying to help. And Messiah, cult of personality, and what I want to do is I wanted to ultimately his ability to do what he did was a result of people having faith in him, really believing in him. And so it's important, I think, to instruct, to help teach people about their own power and about democracy by showing the hollowness of that symbol. And because he is such a powerful symbol, and I think in many ways a symbol of what is wrong with our politics, that's what I try to do. And what I said with, I call him former president of the United States and current Instagram influencer Barack Obama. What I see with this, he has this sort of an obsession with being famous and being considered like very cool. He wrote in Audacity of Hope that, the greatest fear of anybody would be, of course, being embarrassed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I, that there's a sort of a sense in which getting down into the muck to try to help people, to try to like scrape and fight with power isn't worth it, because you'll just get embarrassed and you'll be criticized, and that will hurt your brand. And so I think it's important for people to see that that's his politics, because ultimately, if we don't punch through the symbols of our own lack of willingness to be a free people, then we won't be a free people. And I don't think this is an American thing. I think generally speaking, these ideas are, pretty universal. People want to be free, however they define that.
So, although you criticize Obama's politics, on a substantial level, he did try to counter China, right? He started the Pivot to Asia. I think TPP and TTIP were supposed to be attempts to create new trade blocs excluding China. Although there was flaws in them, he definitely did have an approach. I mean, one of the historians, Alfred McCoy, who famously predicted that China would overtake the US by 2025, he said that Obama really, if he was completely successful, he could have stemmed it, or he could have led to a better outcome. So what do you say to Obama's China policies, or the intent in them?
Obama doesn't believe in wielding power. So, the TTIP and the TPP and all of the pivot to Asia, it was all bullshit. Anybody who read these agreements knew they didn't matter. They didn't make any difference. The reality is that in the foreign policy establishment, no one actually reads any of these agreements. They all just go to panels or talk to each other and tell each other what's in these agreements. But if you actually look at the substance, there was very little there. And to the extent that there was some stuff there, it would have consolidated wealth and power. It actually would have empowered China, because it had country of origin labeling requirements that allowed China to sell TPP compliant cars, or allowed cars that would be TPP compliant to have 65% of their components made in China. It's not something that like anybody who actually talks about the TPP and says, oh, we need to do this, that they understand, because they don't actually know anything about these trade agreements. And I think that's generally true about Obama. It's generally true about most of the, trading world. Like, they really know very little about trade, and they just pretend to be experts.
Okay. So, a lot of what you say about Obama, I could just paraphrase it with your description of Woodrow Wilson in your book. The same professorial image maintenance guys who came in on a progressive wave, but ultimately fumbled the opportunity to make a historic change at crisis point, like Wilson did with the First World War. So wouldn't the right Obama parallel be Woodrow Wilson, instead of people usually calling him JFK of the 21st century?
I think I don't know about Woodrow Wilson. I would say he's, I'd probably go back to Grover Cleveland, maybe. I don't know. It's hard. It's maybe a Herbert Hoover. I think of him as a Herbert Hoover figure, more than anyone else. Just a very conservative guy with, extremely ideological, kind of out of touch, but very much a product of PR. Herbert Hoover was very popular in 1928.
Yeah, he was considered a self-made man, and he had a great story to tell to people. Yeah.
They both mishandled a financial crisis very badly. Obama, had he come in a few years earlier, he would have been crushed in his reelection. As it was, Romney really should have beaten him, but Romney was not a break from Bush, and people didn't like Bush. So that's how I look at Obama. Just a sort of, he's a pretty bad president.
Okay.
I don't think it's like Wilson. But listen, I got to take off.
Okay.
But I appreciate the call, and I just wanted to. You seem like you've done your homework, so
yeah.
But you know a lot about what I've written and said, so that's very flattering.
Yeah.
And sorry for ruining your childhood.
Yeah, that's okay. I hope you've had a great time, and I hope I haven't totally wasted it. And
No, well, it's up to you. I mean, I enjoyed it. I mean, you're obviously very smart, so I'm glad you're thinking about.
Do I get a job?
Did you get a job?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just asking.
I don't have any jobs to give out, but that's also very flattering to say. If assuming that I had a job to offer, I would.
Oh, thank you. Do keep me in mind when you find one.
Okay, sounds good.
Stoller 2032.
Sorry, say that again.
Stoller 2032. After Trump Jr. and Ivanka, Stoller 2032. First Jewish president.
Good. All right, sounds good.
Yeah.
Talk to you later.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, bye.
Yeah, bye.